Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first of a three-part webinar on meaningful online learning, organized by the National E-Learning Center. Um, my name is Mahal Freh. I'm an assistant professor of instructional design and technology, and I'm going to be your moderator for today and for the remaining two sessions. I am super excited to introduce you to our guest speakers today, two amazing educators and online researchers, Dr. Nada Dabbar from the US and Dr. Genia Zghaib from Beirut. Dr. Nada Dabbar, she's a professor and director of the Division of Learning Technologies at George Mason University. She has over 20 years of experience in learning design and technology and an extensive publication record. You should check it out, by the way. It's an impressive publication record, including her latest book titled Meaningful Online Learning, published in 2019, which these webinars are based on. She has participated as keynote and invited speakers at over 40 local, national, and international conferences and venues. And she has also served as a consultant for numerous higher education, corporate, government organizations, and research institutes, and has facilitated a number of learning technologies design and development projects, including the award-winning Learning Asset Technology Integration Support Tool and the Tech Select Decision Aid mobile application. Dr. Genia Zghaib is an assistant professor of instructional design and technology at the University of Belmond in Beirut. She has a PhD in learning technologies design research from George Mason University and two master's degrees in educational psychology and applied linguistics. At Belmond University, she served as the head of the education department for 3 years and is currently serving as the academic coordinator of the instructional design master's program. Dr. Zghaib has over 15 years of teaching and professional development experience in both K-12 and higher education, including her work as the faculty fellow for the Mason Online Center, where she organized professional development sessions and reviewed the design of online courses for faculty teaching online. In this first webinar, Dr. Nada and Dr. Genia will introduce us to a framework for designing and developing online learning and assignments that engage learners in meaningful learning, meaning those designing learning that engage students in intentional, active, constructive, and cooperative and authentic learning opportunities. But before we get started with that, a little bit of housekeeping. The chat is enabled for these sessions. So please use the chat to comment, share your thoughts, interact with other attendees. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat and join in the discussions. Dr. Nada and Dr. Genia will answer questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question that you want to be answered by them, please post them in the Q&A so it doesn't get lost in the chat and it's easier to track later on. Also, this webinar will be recorded and it's going to be posted to the National E-Learning Center's website as well as YouTube for you to access at your convenience. And I think with that, we're ready to dive in. Nada, Genia, you want to take the lead?
Sure. Thank you, Maha. Thank you so much for introducing us. And thank you for the National E-Learning Center in Saudi Arabia for hosting us today. We are excited and thank you everybody for joining us. So this is a series of 3 webinars, as Maha indicated, and they're about online teaching and learning. So we want to sort of provide you with a theoretical, pedagogical underpinnings of online teaching and learning. So in this first webinar, we want to introduce you to the 5 principles for meaningful online learning. And in the second webinar, which is going to take place on Tuesday, September 29th, we're going to introduce you to how to use technology to support these 5 principles of meaningful online learning by using appropriate instructional strategies. And in the third webinar on Thursday, October 1st, we are going to delve into developing online assessments, which is a huge factor or variable for designing appropriate online learning environments. Now, at the end of every webinar, our hope is that you're going to walk away with specific activities you're going to be able to use in your teaching and learning context. So we hope to engage you in how to design appropriate learning activities and how to engage your students in meaningful online learning. So you probably know that students have a very hard time with online learning because of feelings of isolation, lack of social interaction, lack of self-regulated learning skills. So when people learn online, they need to be very self-directed because it's easy to lose focus. It's easier than in a face-to-face classroom setting. So these webinars will provide both the principles and practices that will keep your students, whether in K-12 or higher education, engaged and active. So this first webinar, we're going to provide this framework or approach for thinking about online learning using 5 principles. And we're going to try to make those webinars as interactive as possible. So we will be having some polling in between, and we will be asking you to share and contribute your knowledge at the end. And as Maha said, also we will be having a Q&A in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. So next slide, please, Genia. So for this first webinar, we have 3 objectives. So the first one is just we want to give you sort of an overview of online learning and how this differs from remote emergency teaching. And then we're going to delve into the 5 principles of this meaningful online learning framework. And then we're going to show you specific examples of use that you can use technology to design with those 5 principles in mind. So for the overview of online learning, let's move to the next slide, please. I'm sure that, you know, with this pandemic, you've all felt that we all had to sort of pivot to 100% online without any prior notice. So we want to make sure that we understand the difference between emergency remote teaching and learning and meaningful online teaching and learning. So what's happening right now due to the COVID-19 pandemic is a rush in all of our schools, higher education institutions, as well as training organizations to move all of our teaching and training programs online. Schools had to pivot, as I said, without any advance notice from face-to-face classroom teaching to totally 100% online. This is an unprecedented disruption of our education system. Hence, you've seen the term emergency remote learning, emergency online teaching. We want to emphasize that there's a significant difference between emergency remote teaching and learning and online teaching and learning, or effective online teaching and learning, or meaningful online teaching and learning. So it's not just a matter of recording your lectures and PowerPoint presentations and putting them online. You know, although out of immediacy, this might make a lot of sense at first, but typically it takes a faculty member or a teacher about 4 to 6 months to transition a face-to-face class to an online setting. So you work closely with an instructional designer. So we have a program at George Mason University that focuses on instructional design. This is also my field, as well as Maha's field and Gania's field. So we all know if you want to apply appropriate instructional design principles, you know, it's going to take time to actually transition your course or the entire curriculum to an online context. This is actually happening to me right now. Even though I'm an expert on online learning and I've written books about online learning, we are transitioning our Masters of Science in Learning Design and Technology at George Mason University to a fully online program. So I am working with an instructional designer. We meet once a week and we look at my blended or face-to-face course and how might we transition that to a very effective and interactive online course. So I'm trying to say that it really takes time to carefully and thoughtfully design online learning interactions and online learning experiences. And that's why we're offering these webinar series. We hope that these will provide some support for you in doing just that, in addition to all the supports that your university might be providing or your educational context might be providing. So I'm going to turn it over to Gania now so that she can help us more contextualize the difference between emergency online teaching and effective online learning.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We would like to start with a poll because we know that many of you have been teaching online and you've had the experience of online teaching, but we want to know how you define online learning. So we have a poll that we would like to start with. Here it is. I just initiated the poll, so you should see a box appear in front of you and you need to select an answer and vote. This is great. This is heading in the right direction, actually.
There was also a question in the chat, Maha or Salman, that someone cannot view the, well, the participants, you can't view the participants. I don't think so, right?
No, they can't. It's
Okay.
what usually. Okay, great. I'll give you a few more seconds to vote if you haven't voted already. But we see that the majority, I can see the majority of the answers. So I hope you can all see the poll. All right. Few more seconds. Okay, I see more answers coming, so I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, so I'm ending the poll and I'm going to share the results with you. And apparently the majority said that online learning is learning that uses the internet and pedagogical and technological tools, which is the correct answer. And we will share with you the definition in the next slide. So what is online learning? Online learning that you've been all engaged in for the last months or so. In its simplest form, it's any learning that takes place using the internet as a delivery system. But in this webinar, we would like to focus more on a more meaningful and engaging definition for online learning. That's why I think I'm still sharing. No, okay. So that's why we would like to use the second definition of online learning, which is open and distributed learning environment that uses pedagogical and technological tools to facilitate learning and knowledge building through meaningful action and interaction. This is the definition that we would like to use in our series of webinar. It's a more meaningful and complete definition. But we also want to caution you into what is not considered online learning. Some instructors make the mistake of thinking that online courses can be easily created by uploading lecture notes, creating online tests, and perhaps including some PowerPoint files and web links. While it's true that you can easily develop an online course that way, it certainly will not result in an effective course that promotes meaningful and engaging learning. So courses that do not take into consideration pedagogical approaches lead to higher dropout rates, student disengagement, and passive learning. And bad design of online courses leads to ineffective online learning. And that's why we've been hearing a lot of people complaining about online learning as being ineffective. We want our kids to go back to school. We want to go back to the classroom. Online learning doesn't work. This doesn't mean that online learning is not good. Online learning is a very old field. It's been research on online learning has been there for like a minimum of 20, 30 years. So online learning has best practices and is effective, but it has to be designed in a very good way. And this is why you see the picture on the right side of the screen. Maybe it's the left to you. So there aren't bad cooks, there are bad recipes. If you don't do online learning well, the recipe is not going to work. But it's also important to consider the different communication or interaction formats or modes of online learning. Hence, synchronous and asynchronous learning or communication, also known as communication synchrony. This is what we refer to them in online learning. To begin with, asynchronous online learning and teaching, it takes place in an unscheduled online learning environment. The teacher and the instructor do not meet with the students online at the same time. It means that the learner completes the tasks when he or she chooses at their own pace or time, of course, with deadlines that the teacher and the instructor can indicate. And the online activities usually in asynchronous online learning are highly monitored by the instructor, with the instructor giving continuous feedback to the learners and continuously communicating with them. Asynchronous methods or strategies include audio, video recorded lectures, discussion forums, interactive video lessons, collaborative wikis, social media learning activities, games, and simulations. And of course, these happen, as I said, not in a scheduled time. The students are completing them. There's always a task that the students have to complete individually or collaboratively. And several technologies can be used to support these methods. You might all be aware by now, might be familiar with the learning management systems such as Moodle, Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, the Blackboard that you use as learning managements to deliver asynchronous online learning. There are other technologies, of course, such as wiki technologies, YouTube, Powtoon, GoAnimate, Twitter, and many other technologies which we will talk much more about in the second webinar. On the other hand, synchronous online learning and teaching requires all learners to be online at a scheduled time, like we're doing in this webinar. So similar to this webinar, it is through web conferencing systems. Methods or strategies include instant messaging, live chats, video conferencing, live broadcasting. So it's all scheduled. You and the students have a timed scheduled meeting in order to meet and conduct the teaching. Some technologies that you might all be familiar with by now are Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, Skype, among other technologies that can be used to facilitate synchronous online learning. Now, while there are some advantages to this form of online learning, such as engaging learners in live discussions and creating this social and online presence with the students, where the students can see you, can ask you easily questions, they can see each other, there are some disadvantages that impede participants. For instance, internet connectivity is an issue in many countries. Even in the same house, when many kids are using the same devices on the same internet connectivity, there might be some issues with the connection. Another challenge is keeping learners engaged at all times in the synchronous sessions, keeping them awake, not bored, not disengaged. So a balance between synchronous and asynchronous online learning is recommended. We're going to do another poll now. So we would like to know from you if you have been using any of these methods in your teaching or both. So please share with us which of the following online learning methods you have been using.
I guess some people can't see the poll, maybe because they're like on their mobile phones, but that's okay. So some participants are attempting to answer through the chat, which is fine, but maybe it's because they're on a mobile phone.
All right. All right. So a few more seconds before I end the poll. I see more answers coming in. All right. So apparently the majority of our attendees use a mix of both synchronous and asynchronous online communication methods, which is actually ideal. As I said, they do complete each other, and they're both important because students have to be given time to be working on their own and time to communicate with their peers and with the teacher. So this is really great to hear that that the majority is using a mix of both. This is great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nada to get us started on the five principles for meaningful online learning framework and share some examples of use.
Great, thanks Genia, and thanks everybody. It looks like you're all on the right track based on the polling that we just featured, you know, also for your definition of online learning. I just want to make a brief comment. Somebody in the chat, and you know, I can't see everything all the time as I'm also presenting, but someone asked if, you know, all these things that are not online learning, are they bits and pieces of online learning? I really love that. Yes, they are. In the slide that Dr. Zghaib, that Genia was giving about what is not online learning, you know, thinking about it as just uploading PowerPoint lectures or just, you know, doing synchronous Zoom meetings with your students, the participant is right that they all form bits and pieces of online learning, but they should not be the only way you support online learning. So really what we're trying to do here is give you a framework, a frame of reference, a sort of a model for you to think about as you are designing online learning interactions. So I'm going to present those 5 principles, and as you know, online learning can be influenced by many moderating variables, and Genia already mentioned 2 of those moderating variables, the asynchronous modality or the synchronous modality. I want to say that some other moderating variables that you need to take into consideration when you're designing online learning include motivational factors of your students, extrinsic and intrinsic, pedagogical approach and teaching style, your own pedagogical approach and teaching style, the learner's attitude or belief about oneself, their self-efficacy, and individual and curricular goals and objectives, as well as class size and other environmental factors. Now, as you know, technology is a huge environmental factor in the design of online learning, and that is why we are going to be, we're going to emphasize the affordances of technology and how can these be best leveraged to support meaningful online learning. So on the next slide, this is the framework that we are proposing. And this is the framework that is in the book that Maha mentioned in the beginning. So if you keep this meaningful online...
I'm sorry, it seems that the Arabic letters got disconnected on PowerPoint.
Yeah, they got like...
remember them, right?
That's okay. So this meaningful online learning framework has 5 principles, as you could see. So the first one, I think they're saying is it's clear. So the first one, the active, I think the word in Arabic is fa'al. The second one on the right, if you go down to the right side, is the constructive principle, which is Bannai. And the third principle is the cooperative principle, which is ta'awuni. And the fourth principle on the bottom left is the authentic principle, which is waqi'i. And then there's the intentional principle, which is the goal-directed principle, which is muwajjah, right? Okay. So these are the 5 principles that we want you to keep in mind as you're designing online learning interactions or assignments or activities for your students. And so if you keep those in mind, it will ensure that your students, that their learning is going to be relevant, their learning is going to be transferable to real world, to the workplace context. Their learning is going to be usable. Whatever skills you're teaching them, whatever content you're teaching them is actually going to be applicable in the real world. They're going to be able to use it, because if you keep these 5 principles in mind, it will certainly lead towards more effective learning. And the research has shown us that if you use this framework and you keep those 5 principles in mind, you're going to ensure high quality instructional experiences, and you're going to guarantee effective learning and success for your students. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through them one by one, and then we're going to provide an example of each of those principles of the meaningful online framework. So the first principles is the active. So let's start with the active principle. And in this figure, as you could see, there's also 2 characteristics of the active principle, and those are the manipulative, observant principles. So active learning, as you know, involves students in doing things, right? The short definition of active learning is doing things and thinking or reflecting about the things that you're doing as a student. So another way of looking at active learning is learning by doing. I don't know if you've heard the acronym learning by doing or the term learning by doing. We can also regard active learning as experiential learning. So it's really when you engage your learners in real world tasks, such as putting them in the role of an informal scientist or mathematician or manager, and allowing them to engage with the environment, to manipulate the environment in a positive way, of course. They're actually working within the environment, and also to observe their actions and the consequences of their actions. So meaningful learning begins when we actively engage with our environment and able to observe the effects of these actions in our environment. So what is an example of this principle, and how can it be supported through technology? So I'm going to turn it over to Gania now to give you a specific example of how to implement the active principle in your teaching and learning contexts.
Thank you, Nada. This is really one of the principles that stands out in this framework. An example that you can implement using the synchronous communication method. If you remember the synchronous, it means if you're doing a web conferencing session with your students, a live class session, for example, is using, for example, a collaborative mind map. Just like the one you see in Kaggle, you see the picture on the top right. It's a mind mapping tool, Kaggle. There are many other tools that support mind mapping, like MindMeister, like Bubbles. But what I like about Kaggle is that it supports collaborative activities, collaboration. So you can invite the students to collaborate on the same mind map during your live session. It's a concept which essentially is a visual representation of content. So for example, in an undergraduate course that I'm teaching at UOB, and in many other courses that I teach at the University of Balamand, in one of these courses, I engage students in creating a mind map using a technology called Kaggle. So after I assign readings, for example, for students to complete at home, they come to our live session, web conferencing session, and I would have set up the mind map ahead of time. I invite them, I add their emails to Kaggle on the mind map, and we do it as a collaborative activity. I ask them to add their responses to the mind map in order to synthesize the readings that they have completed. So for instance, qualities of a teacher. What are the qualities of a teacher? Everyone, based on the readings, has to contribute to this mind map and share the qualities of a teacher. For example, this is one of the activities. In the next webinar, of course, we will take a deep dive into the technologies that support online learning. One of them is mind mapping tools. We'll talk more about these. Now, an example of how you can implement the principle of active learning using the asynchronous communication method, asynchronous meaning when you're not live together, would be asking students to post their presentations and projects on VoiceThread. VoiceThread is another technology. What it does, it allows students to post their work, their presentations, their essays, their work that they have completed, and provide each other feedback that can be either written, audio, or video. It's really very interactive and creates this sense of social presence and interaction between students. So now we would like you to share with us if you have used any activity that supports the active principle, any online activity that supports the active principle. So what I would like you to do is scan this QR code on the top left. but I also have to stop sharing here. So I'll give you a minute to scan this QR code so that I activate Mentimeter. So I'm going to use Mentimeter, which is also a polling and a voting tool. It's external outside of Zoom, so I have to leave this PowerPoint now in order to take you there. I will also post the link. I will also post the link to the Mentimeter in the chat. Okay? Okay, some of you have already started answering. Great. So instead of typing names of technologies that you have used, please share with us some activities briefly, some activities that you have used. So I'm going to post the link in the chat. As I said, you can click on it immediately. Sorry, I'm juggling many windows now. Okay, just bear with me. So here's the Mentimeter. Okay, here's the link. If you could not scan. Great, but still I see that you're sharing some technologies, which is really great. And this is something we will be talking about much more in the second webinar. So in this webinar, we would like you more to share some activities you've done. So I see some interesting activities. Nada, do you see the screen with me?
Yes, I do, but group discussion, for example, is a great activity to support active learning, even though we're going to talk about cooperative learning. So it also supports both, asking students to show their experiences regarding the discussion topic. This also supports active learning. So yeah, I'm seeing some specific examples.
So
but again, active learning, it's like learning by doing. You have to engage them in sort of doing something. For example, with maker spaces, if you're teaching science, they could be actively engaged in doing a science experiment, right, Ganya? Or
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's active. It's actually engaging them in hands-on learning activities. I see something about like using Google Docs, students posting their questions for the teacher. Edpuzzle, using Edpuzzle and Padlet, yes, how do you use them? Also, it's not about the technology. We always emphasize this, Nada and I. It's not about the technology only, it's about the pedagogy. How do you use the technology in order to enhance active learning, to promote active learning? So it's good that you have the technology there, but how can you make learning active using this technology? So group discussion, excellent. Asking students to show their experiences regarding the discussed topic, for example, listening and analyzing videos. How do we do this online? What technologies can you use to do this? This is great. Brainstorming, classroom feedback through Answer Garden. Brainstorming is a very good active example for active principle. Matching pictures and sentences or words. This is maybe more at the lower level. Blackboard forum, lab activities. Students asked to post screenshot of their codes to share, ask question, correct errors. Very good. These are all very good examples that can be much more enhanced if you give it more of a hands-on experience where students have actually to create something, to make something, and share it with the class online.
Okay, we need to move.
Right, yeah, we need to move.
Yeah. We still have 4 principles to cover.
Yeah. So the next principle, Nada.
Okay, thanks, Kenya. So the next principle in this meaningful online learning framework is called the constructive principle. And as you see written underneath the constructive principle is sort of two characteristics again, or two features called articulative and reflective. And they mean exactly that. They mean that you want to engage your students in articulating their understanding of the concepts that you're teaching them. And you also want them to reflect on their learning experience, to be observant and reflective. So you want them to start constructing their own simple mental models about how things work, and you want them to explain or reflect on what they observe, hence that articulative attribute, as I mentioned. And with experience, support, and more reflection, their mental models become more complex. So you want to give your students the opportunity to articulate and reflect. And we want to tell you also that the constructive principle and the active principle are interrelated. In fact, you will see as we're done with this meaningful online learning framework that all 5 principles are interdependent and interrelated. So if you're designing a learning activity that supports the active principle, most likely you're also including elements of the constructive principle. Again, that constructive principle is allowing your learners to construct their own understanding of the skills or principles or concepts that you are teaching them. You don't want to just give it to them exactly as it is and have them learn it in isolation. So if we go to the next slide, I can give you an example specifically for supporting this constructive principle. So there's this platform called Mural. If you see on the right-hand side of the slide, it's a proprietary platform and it comes at a cost, so it's not free. But it's a great platform that supports the constructive principle because you can bring your students together all onto this platform, and it's a visual collaborative platform. So if you see at the top of the slide on the top right-hand side, I have the words think and collaborate visually anytime, anywhere. So this platform, this is actually the sort of the branding, if you will, or the logo of this platform called Mural. And what this platform allows you to do is it allows you to use sticky notes. I don't know if you guys can see, I'm holding up sticky notes. And when we are in a face-to-face setting, we usually sometimes when we want to engage students in a constructive learning activity, we give them sticky notes and we put them, you know, on whiteboards or give them easels and say, okay, let's start brainstorming. And I think Genia mentioned that brainstorming collaborative activity. But this one is more aligned with the constructive principle. So we want them to brainstorm solutions to a problem. We want them to brainstorm ideas about a project. Maybe they're working for the environmental health agency in Saudi Arabia. Maybe they're working for the water department and they want to brainstorm solutions for sustainability, environmental solutions. So this is a great way to bring adult learners into this platform and ask them to visually brainstorm their ideas. And there's also a concept called design thinking. So you're really engaging them in thinking and designing solutions to the problems of their field. So they're professionals and you want to engage them in those kinds of solutions. And the reason why this supports the constructive principle is because it allows them to construct their own understanding of those solutions. So it's a workspace, and you can also do this in Google Docs. You can also do this with Google Slides if you want, as we kind of mentioned earlier, but this platform is very specific for this type of visual brainstorming activity. And this is again supporting the synchronous modality. Now so all of them are there at the same time engaging in this brainstorming. Now the other example I will give you very quickly is the asynchronous modality for supporting constructive learning, or the constructive principle. So this is what I'm doing in my class right now. If you look at the top part of this slide, I engage students with online discussions. We use the learning management system Blackboard at George Mason University. So as you could see, it's called a structured online discussion. So it's not just like a free fall, here's a forum, go post what you want. And, it's an open forum, although you can have open forums, but this is a very structured forum. So I tell them right from the beginning, in this forum, we're going to discuss the readings. It's going to start on September 18th. It's going to end on September 21. I give them about 4 or 5 days to engage. I give them a rubric. I tell them, you can't post all of your answers in one day or, engage in this discussion because it's an asynchronous discussion. There's a period of time that you go through the discussion and you get to see the multiple perspectives of your teammates and classmates. So at the same time, you could see on the bottom left that this is a threaded discussion. You could see we could also have our pictures in this LMS forum. So the students who would like to show their pictures, they could do that. You could see my picture in the bottom left there. So it's a threaded discussion. And then what I do is I summarize the discussion at the end, I synthesize it, and I sort of get their ideas and put them in the synthesis. So it's a really good way to engage them in this manipulative, in this articulative and reflective components of the constructive active learning principles, because they're articulating their understanding of the content and they're also reflecting on it after the discussion has ended. And very briefly, there's also another asynchronous way to implement the constructive principle asynchronously, and that's using a blogging platform. And we will talk about the blogging platform in future discussions. So I hope this explains the constructive principle. Now I'm going to move to the cooperative principle. I don't think.
You want to do a Mentimeter, Nada?
I don't think so. Let's do it after the next one, because I think we're kind of like, running out of time.
Yeah.
So the cooperative principle, which is the third one with the circle in green here, you could see it's, of course, it's about engaging your students in collaborative and conversational activities. So this principle obviously is based on social learning. As you know, Vygotsky and others have really tried to emphasize social learning and social learning theory. And right now, all the social media technologies that we have really support social learning. So this principle of the meaningful online learning framework is about cooperative learning and social learning. So as you know, humans naturally engage in social activity, working together in communities, taking advantage of each other's skills and knowledge to support their goals and action. And research has shown there's a strong evidence that inquiry-based collaborative approaches to learning benefit both the individual and the collective knowledge growth. Therefore, we want our learners to work collaboratively, to communicate with each other, to share ideas, to listen to each other's perspectives, and work together to accomplish the task at hand. Now, we know that all real-world complex tasks are never achieved with one person alone. So it's always a collaborative effort. And we want to emphasize this in our online learning designs. So this also enables the co-construction of knowledge, right? So if you go back to the constructive principle of the meaningful online learning framework, right now, you're engaging your students in co-construction of knowledge. So in the constructive principle alone, it was the individuals constructing their own understanding through articulation and reflection. Now with the cooperative principle, it's about the co-construction of knowledge collaboratively. So as you could see, this attribute or principle works closely with the constructive principle of the meaningful online learning framework. So now I'm going to turn it to Genia to present an example and then maybe do the Mentimeter, or do you want to do the Mentimeter first for the cooperative principle? Or you want to just do the example? You have to unmute. You have to unmute, Genia.
Yeah, let's keep going now. And
okay.
Let's have time, of course, we'll do all the Mentimeters.
Okay.
So as Nada has explained earlier, the cooperative principle is based on social theories. And it's really important to create this social presence in online learning. And that's why do not miss a chance to let your students collaborate online. So an example of a synchronous activity that promotes cooperation during an online live session is creating breakout sessions or separate rooms within the video conferencing systems such as WebEx, Zoom, and Microsoft Teams. If you use any of these web conferencing tools, you will notice that you can create groups for your students. So as you're doing your live sessions, you can send them into separate rooms, into separate groups in order to meet and talk about a certain topic and then reconvene as a whole class, of course, if your internet connectivity supports it. So students can be collaborating on a project or a task, and you can pop into these rooms. So as they are collaborating and working, you can go join these sessions and then leave them as an instructor or a teacher, and you can always provide them feedback to these small groups. So just as you do group work in your classes, in your physical classrooms, you can do this group work and teamwork in your online sessions. An example of asynchronous cooperative activity is when learners collaborate online at their own schedule through a technology that allows collaboration. So often teachers or faculty ask me, how can I do group work online? How can I do group projects online? How can I monitor what my students are doing? And the answer is really simple. And guess what? It's even better than doing it without technology. So I think that technology really supports the group work in a sense that you can monitor who of the group members have posted online, who did not post, who's contributing, who's not doing anything. So technologies such as wikis, for example, like PBWorks, I like to use PBWorks. There are wiki tools also integrated in the learning management systems, can help you create groups inside your learning management system where students can collaborate on an activity. They can include the tasks that they're doing, who's doing what, and you can monitor who edited, who added work, who did not add work. So it's really a very good way to monitor and hold students accountable for the group work. Other technologies that you can use for student collaboration that can engage students in collaborative activities are Dropbox, Google Docs, Google Slides, Google Sheets. These are all examples that can help students co-create information, co-create projects, and work together and collaborate. I think we can continue, Nada, and then do a Mentimeter for all of the principles.
Okay. So let me present now the fourth principle. So we've got two more to go. The fourth one is called the authentic principle of the meaningful online learning framework. So most contemporary research on learning has shown that learning tasks that are grounded in the real world through case-based or project-based or problem-based learning are not only better understood and remembered by your students, but they're also more consistently able to transfer their knowledge to new situations. So the point is to relate the assignment in your course to something that is concrete and real, rather than keeping it abstract and based on the textbook or, the isolation of the concept by itself. So you want to engage your students in real world complex problems. Don't try to make things easy for them. Don't strip the complexity of your field. So if you're teaching biology, don't try to make biology very easy. Keep it at its level of complexity. Try to get the students to engage in authentic tasks. What do biologists do in the real world? What do biomedics do in the real world? Bring them authentic examples to the table and have them then try to solve them, engage them in problem solving, in hypothesis generation, etc. So there are models like case-based learning, like I said, project-based learning, problem-based learning that really allow you to bring these authentic problems to your students, to your classrooms. You want to engage them again in a real world complex activity. So by doing so, you would be strengthening the linkages between what they're learning and the conditions in which that learning may be applicable in the real world. So now I'm going to turn it over to Genia to give us an example of how do you implement this authentic learning principle using technology in the two modalities.
Yes. And Nada, yes, this is really hard to demonstrate in online learning. And we hear a lot of teachers and instructors saying, how can I transfer everything we do authentically with the students, the experiments, the role playing, the debates we do in class, the discussions to online and create this authentic learning experience to our students? And the answer is technology. Technology does really give you this privilege of transforming everything from real world to online through video, through labs that exist virtually. So, for example, one of the examples of a synchronous authentic learning activity would be conducting live experiments with your students. For example, if you're doing a science class, you can ask your students to conduct a live experiment, turn their cameras on, and share with the class some of these examples of the experiments that they've done. They can share, they can talk about them, they can bring all of these physical things that they use at home or in a lab and share them with the class. Another example is debates and role-playing exercises. So for example, if you have a debate or a role-playing about a certain topic, the students can turn their cameras on and they can talk about it in a synchronous live session. So all of these, the technology really affords this, and it can allow students to share anything they want. The same principle of authenticity may be achieved asynchronously. And thanks to video, students can record themselves doing any kind of activity or project that the teacher has assigned and sharing it with the class. So this is an example of how we can use. For instance, students can record themselves doing an experiment, completing a task related to a course or a lesson, and sharing it with the class. Another example, another tool that you can use, for example, for this video recording is Flipgrid. So students can record themselves maybe explaining something or discussing something or doing an experiment and sharing it on Flipgrid. Flipgrid is an interesting tool where learners can post videos and reply to each other with videos. This is a very interesting tool. Other tools that can be used in this sense are virtual labs, for example. In order to promote this authentic principle, learners can complete virtual experiments as well and share them with the classroom. So now we're going to move on to the last principle with Nada.
Okay, so the last principle of the meaningful online learning framework is the intentional principle. So this principle is based on the fact that all human behavior is goal directed. So everything we do is intended to fulfill some goal or purpose. Now that goal may be simple, like satisfying hunger on Maslow's taxonomy, or it may be more complex, like developing new career skills, studying for a master's degree, aiming to become a lawyer, etc. So when learners are actively and deliberately working towards a cognitive goal, then they think and learn more because they are fulfilling something that is relevant to their personal goal, to their personal intention. It means something to them. And this is where that self-directed learning comes into play. In that it requires the learner to engage in metacognitive activities, in self-regulatory strategies, such as setting goals, time planning and management, and self-discipline. So you want to give your students tasks that empower them to become self-directed learner. You want to give them agency of their learning. You want to empower them to become effective learners. So you want to empower them to take the lead on things that they feel they are in charge of their learning. You don't want them to be passive learners. You want them to be active learners. So this principle, actually, this intentional principle, kind of circles back to the first principle that we talked about, which is the active principle. And so it's very important to keep in mind that these 5 principles of this meaningful online learning framework are interrelated, they are interdependent. So in other words, if you design learning activities that represent a combination of these principles, then it will result in even more meaningful learning than designing for a single characteristic or principle in isolation. Again, as you notice that When we talk about active learning, it also falls into constructive learning. When we talk about constructive learning, it also kind of dives into cooperative learning, or moves to cooperative learning, authentic learning, and intentional learning. So all of these principles are interdependent. And as you've seen from the activities, so let's move to the example of an activity for the intentional learning principle. Again, we're trying to give the activities in this webinar based on the two modalities, the moderating variables of synchronous and asynchronous technologies. So how do you implement this intentional principle? So Gania mentioned role playing a little bit in the previous principle that we were talking about, but really it's the intentional principle that exemplifies role playing, if you will. So this idea of role playing, again, you give your students roles. It's a very powerful instructional strategy, and we're going to be talking about it in more detail in webinar number 2. So for example, if you're teaching a class that prepares your students to be leaders in their field, you know, education leaders, or you want them to be negotiators, or you want them to be teachers, or you're training them to be managers, or maybe you're training them to be athletic trainers. Training your students on, you can actually give them a role to play, a role that exemplifies the goal to which they aspire to get to. So if you're training them to become coaches, social workers, mentors, etc., then you want to simulate a situation online where they can actually engage in coaching or mentoring activities. So immersive technologies such as simulations and 3D virtual worlds are very suitable for the intentional principle, because sometimes you don't have access to the real world. Now, if you look at that second picture, which is aligned with the asynchronous activity, what's happening here is we are engaging learners in what we call scenario-based e-learning. So if you're teaching them how to become a nurse, you can actually simulate a room that has a patient and has all the tools that nurses use in order to take blood pressure and in order to examine the patient. And they can be doing this in an asynchronous way, which means they could be entering this 3D virtual simulations and actually conducting the processes and procedures that they're going to do when they eventually become a nurse. So if you don't have access to the actual hospital and you don't have internship opportunities for your students to go and actually practice that skill, you can do it through simulations. In terms of the first synchronous modality, if you look at this two visuals from MIT, there's something called mediate.com. If you visit that website, you will find all kinds of cases that you can use with your students for the different skills and topics that you're teaching them. And there's also for K-12, there is a synchronous simulation, or if you want a 3D virtual game-based learning environment called Quest Atlantis. And this one now has developed into something called Quest to Teach. So it's really training your teachers how to teach in a classroom. So you give them a synchronous classroom and they're actually playing the role of a teacher and teaching in a classroom context if they don't have the actual real world classroom to go to in order to practice those skills. So as you could see, that intentional principle can be implemented largely using simulations, games, and other immersive technologies, as well as scenario-based e-learning in the asynchronous context. So give them case-based learning environments, give them videos that simulate cases, and then have them intentionally get together and find solutions to the problems of their field. So finally, just in sort of summarizing, if we go to the next skill, next slide, please, Gania. So as you could see, we have walked you through this meaningful online learning framework through these 5 principles of keeping in mind as you design online learning courses, online learning curricula, online learning interactions for your students, you want to keep in mind these 5 principles: the active principle, the constructive principle, the intentional principle, the authentic principle, and the cooperative principle. And as I've said many times in this webinar, they work interdependently. And then you want to be able to implement these principles by designing learning activities in a synchronous and asynchronous approach, so you could have a good mix of synchronous and asynchronous learning in your courses. So research has shown that tasks designed with these characteristics in mind lead to meaningful and engaged learning. So if you remember, the whole point of doing this and the whole point of giving you this framework is because we want your students to be able to be more self-directed in an online setting. We want them to be engaged in your courses and in your teaching and learning interactions. We want to make sure that you're giving them learning interactions that have value, that have purpose, that have significance, that they view the learning as being relevant, as being transferable, as being usable. So we want to ensure high quality instructional experiences. And we can guarantee that if you use this framework and you design your activities online using these principles in mind, you can pretty much rest assured that your learning will be engaging and meaningful for your students. So I'm gonna now turn it over to Genia so she can maybe go back in the slides and try to, you know, engage you in some of these activities using Mentimeter. So I think we have time for 5 minutes, and then we want to take your questions. So maybe we should go to the, I think it was the authentic principle, Genia.
How about we do one like with all of them? Like you can share any activity that you think supports any of the principles. The slide that I'm going to share is about constructive, but feel free to share an activity that supports any of the principles and maybe right next to it, active, constructive, cooperative, whatever you think this activity supports, because we don't have much time left to go over all the principles. What do you think, Nanda, with the time left?
I don't know, we have like 15 minutes, so.
Yeah, but what if we have questions? We want to leave some time.
Sure, I think we can, yep, that's fine. If you want to do 2 of them.
Genia, there aren't a lot of questions. We have 2 questions maybe. So yeah, you can.
I think we have time to do that.
Yeah.
Go through, yeah.
Great. So we're going to do the constructive principle now. If you've used any online activities that support the constructive principle, we invite you to share it with us on this Mentimeter. I did share the link in the chat.
You might want to, Genia, you might want to go back to remind them of the examples of the constructive, or
I'll have to.
Oh, because you're sharing different screens, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So
just
for your
guys, yeah, the constructive principle is about, you know, engaging your students in constructing their own understanding of the content. So it's got that articulative and reflective component. So for example, to put it to you, like, do you want to, you know, do you engage your students in reflective activities? Do you have them reflect on some of the learning they're doing in your class, or do you actually engage them in online discussions? Okay, we see someone who's using simulations and scenarios. That is excellent. So using simulations and scenarios supports which principle, if I may ask you, which principle of meaningful online learning would the simulations and scenarios support?
Let's see, maybe in the chat someone is answering.
Yeah, maybe it's in the chat then. So the simulation and scenario supports the authentic, yes, e-project learning is amazing, from Maha bint Muhammad bin Abdullah. I just saw the chat. E-learning, e-project learning is really, it supports the the intentional principle, and also the collaborative or cooperative principle. Online discussions, it's great. They're doing online discussions. So those that do online discussions are supporting the constructive principle. Absolutely, because it engages with what
Sorry.
else?
Yeah, Google Doc to write as a group, where students can collaborate to write as a group, and this supports usually the cooperative and principles. Good. Solving problems, cooperative and authentic. So like case-based learning, problem-based learning.
And intentional also, the intentional principle.
Intentional. Social media.
Well, social media is more a technology, but I see something here online through Microsoft Teams. So whoever's using Microsoft Teams definitely supports the cooperative principle, and it allows your students to actually engage in conversational and also in, you know, dialogue and collaborative learning. So definitely Microsoft Teams. Kahoot, right, Genia? Kahoot supports.
Yeah, Kahoot. Yeah, it supports more like formative assessment. So it's sharing.
Right, we're going to talk about that in the assessment, right?
Yeah, material and students can respond. Breakout rooms, excellent what we shared with you today. Blogs on Blackboard, very good. If you can integrate the different features of the LMS, usually LMSs have a lot of integrated features within them, like blogs, wikis within Blackboard and Moodle, discussion forums, tests inside. Experimental design by doing.
Experimental design, that goes back to that active principle, absolutely, that we talked about in the beginning, the manipulative and observant.
Yeah.
Mind mapping, someone is using mind mapping for constructing, that's also articulative, that's also under the constructive principle. I don't know, but the quizzes, right? The quizzes is probably, if you're using it as an assessment tool, then it actually, you know, works more with formative assessment. But if you're using it as a knowledge check, perhaps it can also support reflection. Okay, so maybe we can move to the questions now, or what's happening?
Okay, yeah, maybe we can move to the questions. These are good examples.
Yeah.
Discussion about solving problems. Right, so you just want to make sure that when you're using these technologies, you're keeping the 5 principles in mind. And, you know, ask yourself, how am I supporting active learning? How am I supporting constructive learning? How am I supporting cooperative learning? How am I supporting authentic learning? And how am I supporting intentional learning? And it could be like just one activity that's doing all 5, or it could be multiple activities that's doing a combination.
Yeah. So, Nata, did we share the last slide? I think we
No, I think we should share the book and then move to yeah. So this is the book that is really, we're basing this framework from. It's the book, Genia's using it in her classes. I'm using it in my classes at the grad level for instructional design programs. Many other faculty are using it at different universities in the US and abroad. So it's a book that came out in 2019, as Maha mentioned, and it's really not highly theoretical at all. It's very applicable. And as you'll see from the webinar we're going to do on Tuesday and the follow-up on Thursday, that it's very hands-on, it's very concrete. So again, you'll walk out with some specific examples. So that, you know, that's the book that we're basing these webinars on. So everything that we're talking about, the framework is included, the different types of technologies that we're going to show you on Tuesday, and the affordances of technologies. We have a great, nice framework for that. And then we're going to go into assessment on Thursday. Someone was asking, you're grading. Of course, you're going to be grading your students, but we're going to talk about assessment more from a formative perspective rather than a summative perspective. So stay tuned about that for the webinar on Thursday.
And this is our contact information in case you would like to have any questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions. First of all, thank you so much. The session was great. I'm seeing a lot of positive comments, so thank you. There are a few questions. Bakr, but before we talk about the questions, everyone is concerned about their name and about the certificates and how they're going to receive
why
them.
is that? Why is everybody asking if their name? I couldn't understand that.
Yeah, well, the certificate, I'm not sure what the process is with the National E-Learning Center, so I apologize for those who, I didn't answer. But they're concerned about their names because of the certificates that they're going to receive.
Okay.
But if you signed up for these webinars, you signed up with an email and your name, and you should have logged into this session with the email that you used to register. So it's before our next webinars, it's better if you check your Zoom account and make sure that your name is displayed the way you want it to be displayed. And the certificates, like I said, is going to be based on, they're going to use or download like the activity for today's session. And then they're going to link the emails to the emails in the registration form, and then send you those certificates. So I hope that's clear, but before next session, it's better if you check your Zoom accounts, make sure that your names are spelled out correctly, so that we don't go through this again on Tuesday. Now for the questions, Nada, there's one question from Bakr Ahmed. He asks he's asking, what do we call what is happening nowadays because of the coronavirus? Is it online, e-learning, or distance learning?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if we can go back to that slide again, the one in the beginning, please, since you're doing that. I mean, right now, if you read the articles, they're calling it emergency remote teaching, right? And so that's what we kind of, so right now, if you look at the literature or some of the articles that are coming out, they're calling it COVID-19, emergency remote teaching and learning, and how, as I mentioned, all of us had to pivot immediately to a fully online context. So it was a very disrupted our whole education system because of this pandemic. So they call it emergency remote teaching and learning. So I hope this answered your question. And what we were trying to do here is to really kind of show the difference between what we had to do right immediately to pivot and what we really need to be doing in order to transition to online learning that is evidence-based and high quality and engaging.
Right. Yeah, we can no longer really stick to the remote teaching term. And that's why we're doing these webinars, in order to promote this awareness, because we feel that many schools and universities are using the remote teaching approach, only transitioning everything that's being done in a face-to-face class to an online environment via webcam. So this is not enough.
So there are a couple of questions about elementary age students. So they're asking, are these principles applicable to that age? And then there was another question about whether, like, if there is a minimum number of these principles that should be included in like e-training. So
I will leave the question for K-12 learners to Genia to answer. As to the minimum number, as I said, all of these 5 principles, active, constructive, authentic, cooperative, and intentional, are interdependent and they're interrelated. So as you could see from the activities that we showed you and the examples, there's at least 2 or 3 principles embedded in each of those examples, but we highlight the main principle first, right? And so you know, you really need to think about this framework as an interdependent, interrelated framework. And when you try to create activities, most likely, if you create an activity to support active learning, then you're pretty much also supporting constructive learning. So we want you to look at the framework as a whole and just use it as a mental model for when you're designing online activities. So I'll leave it to Genia to answer with K-12. I think we've given some examples in K-12 contexts, Genia, and you know, yeah.
But I think the question is specifically about elementary kids, elementary students who are not as mature as older classes. Yes, there is room for active learning in these classes. There is room for constructive learning. There is room for intentional learning and for authentic learning. Cooperative is okay. Yes, you might see some elements of cooperative learning there, but they have to be supported by the teacher and by the parents. But the way online teaching is happening right now does not cover any of the principles, unfortunately. I've seen it in my kids' school. I've seen it in other teachers telling me how they're doing online teaching. They need to rethink the online teaching itself, how they're teaching, and not focus mainly on synchronous online teaching, because this kills any authenticity, any active learning, any constructive learning if it's only teacher-centered. Yes, there is room to integrate all of these principles in elementary.
Okay, we're at the end of our time. This was great. An hour passed by. I didn't even feel it. So thank you all for joining us today, and special thank you to you, Dr. Neda and Dr. Genia. I would also like to thank our behind the scene team from the National E-Learning Center. So thank you guys. Today, Dr. Neda and Dr. Genia laid the groundwork for the next two webinars, where they will be discussing the practical implications of the framework on our instructional strategies and assessment practices. So please don't forget to join us again on Tuesday at 7 p.m. And until then, please take care, stay safe, and have a good night.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Maha. Thank you so much. Thank you. See you soon. See you on Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.